Hi, I'm Casey, and I'm from San Diego. Everyone who knows me knows how impulsive I can be. I'm like the total opposite of my friend Patrick, who is such a nerd. He's the biggest coward ever. So I was starting to wonder why we were even friends. That was until he came back to San Diego one weekend with a gorgeous stranger. You see, after Patrick graduated from high school, he moved to LA for college. I stayed at home to help my family run our guest house. I have always loved the beach, the sun, and the wind. The roar of the waves and the smell of salty air all combined to be a part of me, so I would never want to leave my hometown. Until one day, winter break rolled around, Patrick showed up at my door carrying a whole bunch of luggage. I was so happy to see him, but also confused. "Do you want to stay here?" I asked him. He just laughed and said, "No, silly, not me. I've brought you some business." Then I noticed a group of people behind him. I ran out to help them with their luggage, and there was one guy who looked like he was really struggling. I asked him if he needed some help, and when he looked up, I couldn't believe it. He was the most handsome guy I'd ever laid my eyes on. They ended up staying at our guest house for a whole week, and it was seriously the best week ever. I could hardly take my eyes off of him. His name was Jacob, and I wanted him to stay with us forever. I watched him as he played volleyball with his friends, and when he chopped firewood to build a bonfire. And then his voice, oh my gosh, when he sang, it was like I was in heaven. One night, him and his friends all sat around the fire singing and playing guitar, and I watched from the porch, wishing that night would last forever. After they went back to LA, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Why hadn't I told him how I felt? Now I'd missed my chance. But then I realized I had to see him again. No matter what, I was going to go to LA and tell him. I asked Patrick if he could help me. I had to find a way to get into their college. I had to be closer to Jacob. My grades were pretty pathetic, but somehow Patrick managed to convince the scholarship department to give me a chance. The school had a few sports scholarships on offer, and after a month of waiting to hear, I found out I got it. It was hard to convince my parents to send their little girl away, but Patrick helped a lot, and somehow they have always trusted him over me since we were kids. But I didn't mind, because all I could think about was how I'd see Jacob again soon. When I arrived in LA, Patrick picked me up at the airport and told me that I would stay with him for a few days until I could move into my own dorm. As usual, he was being over careful and kept saying I had to take every precaution I could ever think of, because LA was so dangerous and that he didn't want me to stay out late at night. Typical Patrick, he was even worse than my dad. And it was so ironic because I was the one that always protected him. When we were kids, I'd saved him from a whole group of bullies. So if anyone needed to be worried about danger, it was him, not me. I was the brave one around here. Patrick seemed so excited to see me, and I felt bad because all I could think about was Jacob. I was about to ask him about him when we arrived at Patrick's place. I followed him inside, and then I heard a couple voices. I turned to him and said, "Oh, I didn't realize you had roommates." Then he said, "I only have one. Jacob, remember him?" My heart started racing. Jacob was here, in this house? But then Patrick said, "Oh, and that other voice is his girlfriend's. She's been spending a lot of time here recently." Oh my God, my heart sank. Jacob had a girlfriend? I couldn't believe it. The next moment, Jacob and his girlfriend appeared, and I just froze. This couldn't be happening. I'd been too late. My life was over. What was the point in even being here? That night, we all had dinner together, and I could barely eat. It was so awkward, and I just wanted to go home. Jacob's girlfriend was called Sarah, and she was so clingy. She wouldn't leave Jacob alone even for a second, and I didn't understand why they were together. She wasn't even pretty. She had fake eyelashes, a fake tan, and even her hair looked fake. She was like a doll, and I just thought that Jacob could do so much better. I didn't really speak except to ask how long they'd been together, and Sarah replied and said, 2 months. The 2 best months of my whole life. Isn't that right, babe? Then she kissed him. Yuck. I wanted to puke. The whole time I noticed Jacob kept looking at me, and I knew that it was me he actually liked, not her. Something about the way he kept glancing over at me. My intuition was never wrong. Sure, she'd managed to wrap him around her little finger, but before long, he'd be mine. I hadn't worked this hard for nothing. I needed to come up with a plan quickly to make him dump Sarah and start dating me. The next day, I made up an excuse to Patrick, saying that my dorm wasn't ready yet, and would it be okay if I stayed with them for a bit longer. Patrick didn't mind at all. Yay! Now I'd have more time to be around Jacob so I could win him over. Luckily, Sarah had a job in the evenings, so she was out a lot. Whenever she wasn't there, Jacob acted so differently. One night, he asked if I wanted to watch a movie with him, and he even shared his popcorn with me. And then one day, I was struggling with my computer, and he stopped what he was doing to help me. Surely he wouldn't do that if he didn't like me, right? I was sitting right next to him. He was so close. I could have just leaned over and kissed him, and I thought about it. But then suddenly his phone started ringing, and it was Sarah. He ignored it, and I really got my hopes up. But then she called again, and he answered and apologized, saying he'd been helping me. I could hear how angry Sarah was, and after that day, he didn't speak to me as much. It made me so mad, and I realized I needed to find a way to get rid of Sarah ASAP. She was ruining everything. She obviously saw me as a threat, and pretty soon it was like World War III whenever I saw her. Jacob's birthday was coming up, and I wanted to make sure I got him the best gift ever. I asked Patrick for advice, but then on his birthday, I handed his gift over, and he said Sarah had just given him exactly the same thing. I couldn't believe it. Turns out Sarah had overheard Patrick telling me what Jacob would like and wanted to show me up. I'd also made him a cake, and when I went to bring it out to him, Sarah bumped into me and it went flying. She was such a psycho. After that day, I really couldn't stand being near her. But then the cherry on top happened. She borrowed Jacob's car, and then she crashed it into Patrick's car, which I had been using to get to class and back. When Jacob found out, he went crazy. But you won't believe it. She blamed me. She said I'd driven into her. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I told Jacob it was her fault, but he didn't say anything. He just ignored me. I tried to speak to Patrick about it all, but he said it was too much drama and he wasn't interested. And he couldn't help with Jacob either because he had started hanging out with some new friends, and they two were no longer close buddies anymore. I hated Sarah more than ever after that. But at this point, Jacob's new friends even made me more curious. I realized he was acting differently, like coming home really late at night, getting drunk, and burning money on parties and such. I heard that he would host a party at the house that weekend. So anyways, I decided this could be a good opportunity for me to impress Jacob and his new friends. So I wore a designer dress and even prepared almost everything. As Jacob's friends arrived, I welcomed them all, but they barely acknowledged me. They were all huddled around Sarah, and it looked like they were flirting with her. Patrick stayed in his room. That's how much he disliked Jacob's new friends. And pretty soon, Jacob was asleep on the couch after drinking too much. I decided I was going to leave the party and go to bed too, but then I overheard Jacob's friends whispering. They said that now was their chance to have some fun with Sarah. I was shocked. Were they going to hurt her? I started to panic and ran to find Sarah. I told her what I'd heard, but she just laughed and said I was pathetic. Fine then, why should I care about her? She was my enemy. So what did it matter? I went to the spare room and lay down, but I was worried. I was the only one who knew she was in danger. If something happened to her, I'd regret it forever. I needed to make a decision. Little did I know how bad things were about to get. In the first part of my story, I told you how I moved to LA to chase my crush Jacob. But when I arrived, I quickly discovered that he already had a girlfriend called Sarah, and that if I wanted to win him over, I had to get rid of her first. But then Sarah got into a dangerous situation, and ironically, the only person who could help her was me, her enemy. Even though she was the last person I wanted to help, I knew I couldn't be selfish. I had to do something, and quickly. I was so anxious as I watched the guys lead her outside. Where were they going? Did they plan to harm her? I ran to find Jacob in panic, but he was getting blackout drunk and I couldn't wake him up. At that point, I was freaking out, but suddenly I remembered that Patrick was just upstairs. I ran up to get him and told him what had happened, and he raced downstairs just in time to see those guys getting into a pickup truck with Sarah. Patrick ran towards them and then quickly ducked down so they wouldn't see him. He opened the back of the truck and then quickly closed it again and came back over to me. "What the heck are you doing?" I whispered to him. Suddenly the truck was driving off. Why hadn't he stopped them? Then he told me he dropped his phone in their trunk. I didn't understand. "Why would you do something stupid like that?" I asked him. He took my phone and logged into his iCloud, and then he showed me a red dot on the satellite map. It was his phone, and the red dot was moving. Oh my God, he was so smart. We ran to the garage to get his car, or at least so I thought anyway, But then he threw a helmet at me and I realized we were about to go on a wild ride on his motorbike. But there was no time to argue. This could literally be a matter of life and death. So I jumped on and off we went. There I was, sitting behind the biggest nerd on a motorbike in my designer dress that kept flying up in the wind. I was holding my phone in one hand so that I could direct him. "They're heading for the forest," I told him. "This is way too dangerous. Let's just call the cops," I suggested. But he just replied saying, "Hold on tight, you can trust me." Wow, I'd never heard him speak like that before. So brave and determined. As he sped up, I found myself holding on to him even more tightly, almost hugging him. When had he become so big and muscular? The shy little boy he'd always been was suddenly nowhere in sight. Patrick had become strong and brave, and I have to be honest, I liked it. I could see on the map that they'd stopped at some house, and as we got closer, we saw that it was definitely an abandoned house. We hid behind a tree at a safe distance and started walking through the trees toward the house. Of course, Patrick sent the police our location and told them to hurry. Then, we went around to the back of the house to see what was happening. On our way there, Patrick led the way, and even held my hand to make sure I didn't fall. I felt so safe, like a little kid, and didn't want to let him go. Oh my God, how blind had I been? Patrick was right in front of me this whole time, and I'd been too busy focusing on Jacob to even notice him. By the time we reached the house, we crouched down under a window so that we could peek inside. There was a light shining inside, so I had a look, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The room looked like some kind of headquarters, and even though it was in an abandoned house, there were tables set up and weird shapes on the wall and stuff. Then I noticed Sarah. She was sitting on the sofa, leaning on one of them. One of the guys was giving her something to drink, and I started panicking even more because she already looked really drunk. Then another guy walked in, and I heard him say, "Shall we start now?" The others laughed and said, "Just one more minute." Then the same guy kept giving her more of the drink. She couldn't even open her eyes by then. She was basically unconscious. I turned to Patrick and asked him if the police were on their way. Then I told him we couldn't wait any longer. We had to help her. But Patrick told me to calm down. Then he held my hand and we went around the side of the house to the back door. We snuck in as quietly as possible, and Patrick asked me to hide in a blind corner of the house. Then he took my phone and said, "I'll be back in a minute, don't worry," and ran upstairs. A minute later he was back, and he gave me a huge hug and said, "If you hear anything, don't panic, it's just your phone making the sound." Then right at that moment I heard the sound of people talking upstairs. Honestly, if Patrick hadn't warned me, I'd have screamed my head off. I got such a fright. The three guys ran upstairs to where the noise was coming from, and while they searched around, Patrick pulled me into the room so we could save Sarah. He grabbed her and was about to put her on his back and give her a piggyback when she opened her eyes and shouted, "What on earth are you doing?" I replied to her, "Oh, thank God you're awake. Keep quiet and follow us quickly, otherwise they'll hurt you." And then she said, "No one wants to hurt me, you idiot." And then she shouted for the guys to come back. They arrived in a second, and suddenly one of them had a hold of me, and two others grabbed Patrick. They were laughing, and the one holding me said, "Time to pay the price for interrupting our fun, you freak." Then Sarah said, "Let Casey entertain us tonight. I'm sure she'll be good at it." Then she brought out her phone and started filming and said, "If you tell people what you're about to see here tonight, your life will be over." That was it. I was so naive as not to realize that Sarah and the guys were on the same side of the fence. At that, the guy holding me pushed me down onto the sofa and held me so tightly I couldn't move an inch. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. But suddenly there was a loud noise behind us, and Patrick managed to escape by pushing the guys away. He started fighting with the three guys, so I used that opportunity to get up, but Sarah grabbed me, and I had to pull her hair and try to get free. Luckily, the police arrived at that exact moment. I dread to think what could have happened to us if they hadn't arrived right then. It ended up being such an exhausting night. We went to the police station and we were all interrogated. Sarah kept crying and tried to act like a victim, but the police discovered she had high levels of alcohol in her bloodstream, and then, of course, there was a video on her phone where she threatened me. The guys also admitted that they had come there quite often, and that night was not the first time they went wild together. Now I understand how crazy and dangerous LA is. The whole time I thought she was some kind of innocent victim and risked my life to help her. After that night, Jacob realized just how awful Sarah was. I didn't understand how we hadn't seen how fake she was all along, but at least it was all out in the open now. And of course, after that, Jacob started flirting with me. But for some reason, I just wasn't interested in him anymore. After all my hard work to win him over, I realized he wasn't the one I wanted to be with. There was someone else that was making my heart race. The one who let me hold him so tightly on the back of his motorbike. Who made me feel so safe and who would do anything to protect me, like kicking rocks aside and holding my hand so I wouldn't trip. The calmest, smartest guy, the one who I have always been able to count on. He was right there all along. My Patrick. Do you think I should tell him how I feel? Or should I go out with Jacob after all the effort it took me to get him to notice me? Who am I kidding? Let's be honest. It wasn't a hard choice to make. I told Patrick how I felt, and oh my God, he went crazy. I've never seen anyone so happy before. He told me he'd been in love with me ever since we were kids, but he'd never dared to tell me because he was afraid that I'd laugh in his face and make our friendship super awkward. But guess what? Now we're together and we're so happy. So I guess moving to LA wasn't such a bad decision after all, right? A happy ending, even if it wasn't the one that I expected. But sometimes those are the best kinds of endings.